Okay, in our series of Her Stories 100 Women's Voices, today I am very fortunate to have a retired high school science teacher, Mrs. Carol Thomas, who's going to be sharing her story in the next couple of minutes. I wanted to just give an overview. My name is Dr. Mary Lou Marcillo, and I wanted to explain why I made the decision to do this series. And there were really two reasons. One was recently in the news, there was an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal telling the future First Lady, Dr. Jill Biden, that she really shouldn't use her title of doctor because at the end of the day, she's not a medical doctor, one. And two, her most important role is going to be that as First Lady and wife of Joe Biden. And so I thought, how is it possible that in the year 2021, we're still living in a system of patriarchy and misogyny that often really pushes women to suppress their voice, to be silent? And it's not uncommon to hear that, and it shouldn't be surprising to most of us who have some age maturity. We've experienced that type of discrimination, that type of misogyny, that type of patriarchy throughout our lives, whether it was in school, whether it was as students, whether it was in our professional careers. We've had to cope with it and deal with it. And I think it's really important to have women really tell their stories about how they overcame those challenges, because it isn't always easy and everybody's story is very unique. The second reason I made the decision to do this series is because I wanted to honor my mother. My mother's been gone now 10 years, and it's only recently that I've begun to really understand who she was as a woman. I only saw her as a mom, and I think most of us who have parents only see them in one dimension. And it's only recently that I began to actually understand who my mother was in her 20s, in her 30s, in her 40s, before she became my mother. And the thing about that is, in understanding who she was as a mother, as a woman, it really helped me understand the decisions that she made as a mother, and then how that shaped me and how I became who I am today. So I think it's important, in the same way that Mrs. Thomas is a mom and people know her as a mom, her sons know her as a mom, and your former students know you as Mrs. Thomas, right? The science teacher. No one really knows you in all those facets of being a woman, especially in an industry, in a field, in the science field, that especially in your generation of women really weren't encouraged to go into the field of science. But then further, you were a teacher in a system that is predominantly led by white men. So administration tends to be very male-centric, whereas teaching tends to be very female-centric. And you see this dichotomy, and they don't always intersect. So there's challenges around that you were confronted with, especially if you wanted to do administrative type of work. So without further ado, I'm going to bring Ms. Carol Thomas. Thank you so much for being with me today. And let me start the questions for you.
Sure, Dr. Mazzell, thank you very much for asking me to do this. It's quite an honor. Thank you.
Thank you. And I was very fortunate because I got a chance to meet you as the teacher, the science teacher for, I think, all three of my children. I know Sam had you for sure, but I believe all three of them had you in the middle school. So thank you. So tell me, Ms. Thomas, where did you grow up and what was that like?
Well, I grew up in West Orange, New Jersey, which is close to where I live now, so I haven't gone very far. It's a very large town, but I grew up in a small neighborhood. I went to a small Catholic school. So the 50 of us were together in school from kindergarten through 8th grade. And it's true what they say is you don't really know you're poor until the rest of the world comes in on you, or you meet the rest of the world. We were just a small blue collar school. The dads worked, the moms primarily did not, except my mom did, because I think we were a little more poor than the rest of the neighborhood. I'm not sure. So my mom also worked, which put a lot more household responsibilities on my sisters and I. And so we grew up with having that responsibility. She worked for a while at night, which was very different for a family to have a mom working the night shift. And so we learned how to take care of things during the day and prepare meals, and that necessarily my friends didn't have to do. I think growing up in a small community was easier then than it is now, with all the, we certainly had bullies and mean girls, but with the social media now, I think it's a whole different, growing up now is totally different than it was back in the 60s, 70s. But it was a nice growing up, I went from the Catholic school to to public school, which was a big change, and then to a very large high school. And that's when we got to meet people of different neighborhoods and different socioeconomic
Yeah,
means.
'cause West
Quite
Orange is a pretty big city. I mean,
West
West
Orange is
Orange
a
is
big
pretty
town.
big. Mhm.
At the time, there were two high schools, and so I went to what's called Mountain High, which is now the West Orange High, on one side of town. So it was we got to meet people, different types of people, and um, there were different challenges as we went to high school, reaching out to and learning how to. It was still a very waspy kind of school, which wasn't necessarily good for some development. It would have been nice to have had some exposure to even more cultures, but eventually I had the opportunity to do that in college. Um, as I said before, we didn't have a lot of money, so when it came time to picking a college, it was okay. What state school am I going to go to? And I picked the state school that was furthest away from home, which at the time was Glassboro State in New Jersey.
And that's really like, it's almost 3 hours, I think.
2 hours.
2 hours. Okay.
Just about exactly 100 miles. Um, but I knew I had to go to a state school. I applied to a couple of the Rutgers schools and Glassboro, which is currently um, Rowan University now. It was Glassboro State College then. And I went through college on basically financial aid and student loans. By the time I got to college, my father was disabled or on disability. So I had aid to dependent children, and I qualified for a school job. So I worked and I had aid and the loan that I went through school on. So
Now,
I
in
have
the,
to.
in the pecking order in your family, are you the youngest, the middle, the oldest?
I'm number 6 out of 7. We had what they call today a blended family. Then it wasn't called a blended family. I went to a Catholic school where both my parents were divorced, and this was a second family. So we never talked about that much
Right.
because divorce in the 60s and 70s, and the Catholic family wasn't discussed.
Taboo. Right. Mhm.
My older siblings didn't live with us, so that would have been another question. Well, if your mother has other children, why are they not with you? And that's a different story about my mom. Um, so in the family, yes, I'm number 6 out of 7, but I was the first one to go to a 4-year college. My older sister did go to business school, but college was not something. I was the first one in my family, my nuclear family, even extended family, to go to college. So that was quite an experience. But
Now,
they
was
had
that encouraged, or was there more of a push to get you to work, to get a trade and become a worker in that sense?
I had done well in school, so I think the expectation was that I would be going to college. Um, and the same, my older sister, who's 9 years older, was the first one to bring it up, and she went to a business school. But by the time I came around, I think for me, I had always expected to go. My younger sister, who's only 18 months younger, did not go to a college. She very well, she could have. She was quite bright, but chose. She was in the working field. She got an accounting job quite young, and she was gifted at that. And she's a comptroller now, and she's just always been in that field. But in my group of friends in school, maybe 30% went to college. It wasn't necessarily encouraged at that time. And personally, I think my folks expected that I would. But
Mhm.
if I had said that I had chose a different career and didn't need to go to school, I think they would have been okay with it. But it was something they helped as much as they could. With applications, it was all so new. Everything was handwritten. They had no experience with the bureaucracy of trying to get into school and taking the tests. But they did what they could to help, and
Mhm.
but they didn't have a lot of ability to be able to do that. So
And that is true even today with many first generation students who don't have anyone who's gone before them. So they have to kind of figure that out. And, oftentimes the good thing is, in many ways, today, I think people are more cognizant of that. So schools have some type of support in most cases where, they'll have an advisor or someone who's going to help to guide them through that process. Because I know for me, just like you, it was the same situation. Now, it's the first in my family to go to college. My parents didn't speak English. So it was one of those things where, I had to figure out how to apply, where to get the money to send, apply for the application, and SATs and PSATs. I didn't know what any of that stuff was. It was like, what do I have to do? And so, yeah, that makes it very challenging in general. But of course, let me ask you this, because one of the things you mentioned in the early part of your introduction was that your mother worked.
Right.
You worked a night shift, so that meant that you and your siblings had a lot of responsibility thrust upon you. Did you ever resent that responsibility? And then the second question that is related to you applying to colleges is, how did having that responsibility thrust upon you prepare you to be a leader and to kind of figure out what you had to do to navigate and get into college?
In terms of regretting or not regretting the words you used,
Resent, because a lot of times, you're a kid, you want to be
resenting
a
my
kid.
working is, naturally as a kid, you don't want to have to do your chores before you go out or before you have things to do, but it was just expected. It wasn't, you could resent it all you want, but it was something we had to do. If you wanted dinner, you were going to get dinner started, or there wasn't going to be dinner. So
Right.
you had it done. If you wanted your shirts ironed to go to school, you ironed them, because my mother didn't have time to iron them, and or my father's that he wore to work. So it was just something you did, and I felt it was part of my responsibility. She talked about the things she had to do growing up, so I just thought as part of a family, that was something that you did. You
Well,
didn't want
I think
to,
that that's a really, actually, I think that that's a really good thing. I think in some cases, current generation of children often don't have very many responsibilities. They like those, right? They don't have to care for younger siblings. They don't have to iron their clothes. They don't have to start dinner. Um, and then as they mature, then they have a harder time dealing with like bureaucracies, like applying for college, because all along someone else has done everything for them, right? And I think, like you, I also had to start dinner. I had to cook dinner. I had to wash my own clothes when I got home from school. I had to start my homework. I had to clean something. Every day my mother was like, today you're cleaning the bathroom. I was like,
right,
great.
right,
So every day I had some responsibility. And I know that when I ended up applying to college, although it was new to me, I also kind of took it on. I never expected someone else to do it for me.
no. No, I was exactly the same way. Those were my responsibilities. I was the one going to school, and I had to figure out how to do that. You did have a little bit of help in from your guidance department, which I'll talk about in a minute. Not as much help as I had thought, but you had to take on those responsibilities yourself. I happened to be a a responsible child. There's different types of people, so I
Right.
think it came a little more naturally to me, and I'm sure some people would have to struggle even harder to be able to take on that role,
Mhm.
because it came a little more intuitively to me than to other people. But if you want things, you have to learn how to do it. You can't wait for someone else to you have to grab that ring and try and do it yourself. Can't wait for
Mhm.
other people to do it.
Mhm. So now, what made you decide science? Did you start out as a science major at Rowan?
I didn't. I started as a psychology major because I wanted to be a guidance counselor. Because when I was in high school, I would hang out with my guidance counselor, and it seemed like a fun job. So I went to college. I want to be a guidance counselor, like my cool guidance counselor, and then got to college and found out you couldn't become a guidance counselor unless you taught first, and that he wasn't the cool guy that I thought he was, because a lot of things he let the ball drop on.
Yeah.
Um, and so just I had to, reteach myself things in college, just reimagine what teaching was about, because I didn't have the guidance that I thought I did when I got there. And I said, yeah, okay, I still want to be a guidance counselor, but I want to do it I want to be a different kind of role model for people.
Mhm.
So I had to switch to teaching, and I always liked math and science. So I switched to math and science education, which I really enjoyed. I would have been maybe just a pure science major, but I still was moving toward that guidance position. So I went with the math and science education, and that was interesting. The math classes were more of a challenge than I thought they would be. I enjoyed the science classes more, but they were also a challenge, coming from, I think, a high school that I did okay in math and science, but there were students that were much more um, gifted in those areas when I got to college. So I had to, push my way through, and I had to get a tutor for my calculus class. But I worked through that. The same thing
Well,
with the
that
right,
says something about your character, right?
right.
Because it could have been easier to just say, you know what, forget it. I'm gonna do some other major that is easier, and I'm not gonna be challenged this way, because no one wants to get a tutor. That means it's hard, right? It's hard. And who wants to do this extra work of sitting with somebody who's got to explain this to you, and you got to
Mhm.
go through that process? But you persisted despite the fact that it wasn't your strength.
Right. I mean, I had a goal. So in order to obtain that goal, I had to work through those challenges. And I think maybe my upbringing prepared me to work through those challenges a little more than other people. Like you said, it's if you've had it very easy all along, maybe it's harder to you know overcome those challenges. But I got the tutor. I went to the science classes, and what's interesting is, as we were speaking of before, all the professors were male. All my college science professors and math professors were all men, even though a large percentage of the class was female at the time, because we're talking the early 80s, so more women were starting to come into the field. Although I can't say that anybody in high school ever encouraged um, me to do that. There might have been some other people encouraged, but I personally was never, no one ever told me you're good at science, you should pursue that, which is a goal I had with all of my students when I was teaching. If I found somebody that really had an affinity for it, I made the point of telling them that you have this gift for science. You see the big picture is really what you want to do when you're teaching science, and if you can, you know, be deductive and inductive about your reasoning, it's a perfect field for a lot of people. So
Mhm.
going through college, I graduated with a degree in teaching math and science, and at the time there were not a lot of teaching jobs available, but there were science openings, and so I was fortunate enough to get a science job pretty quickly out of college. And then I switched from where I was in West Orange, excuse me, teaching math, and then I switched to Bloomfield teaching science. And so that was that's how I got into the teaching. At that point, counseling was gone because I didn't have a degree in counseling. I have since got my master's in counseling, but that was at night, 5 years going to school at night just before I had my children. But that was my goal, and I kept pursuing it. It wasn't easy. I finished it up just as I had my first child. So I never did get a job in a guidance department, because when I did go back teaching full time, another science position came up. So I stayed in the science because I was happy there. But
Mhm.
maybe I'll go back to guidance sometime now in my retirement. We'll see.
Right, exactly. Now, at some point, I mean, you were a young woman, obviously starting your educational career. When did you get married and become a mom? How old were you? And how was that balancing work and family and then becoming a mom?
I say that I was lucky because we didn't get married till I had just before I turned 30. So all through my 20s, I worked and I was independent and lived home and then had my own apartment. And so I really had time to establish myself um,
Your
in my
profession.
work habits, in my profession, in the way I conducted myself before I was married. And then we had my children. I was 32 and then 34. I did stay home for a few years after I had my second child. But at that time, staying home, I still stayed involved in community organizations because for me, I needed that stimulus. I needed some kind of stimulus other than two little kids at home.
Right. I
So
understand.
yeah, what that helped me learn, as did my first 10 years teaching, that the way you relate to other people in the classroom is one thing, but relating to superiors and relating to community organizations, and whether it be the mayor or the town council or in the Senate, watching what's going on, is you learn how to communicate with other people and not be aggressive, but to be assertive. I really practiced, I think, in those 10 years from 22 to 32, how to be assertive but respectful. And I think I gained some respect from community members in learning how to do that. Um, Speak your mind and don't be afraid to um, ask questions and afraid to broach subjects. Do it respectfully. It gets you further than yelling.
Mhm.
But that was something I really developed in my 20s, is that ability to speak to authority. I'll put it that way.
And that's interesting because of course as women we're not often trained in that. We don't usually have the opportunity to be put in positions where we can exert our own voice and become, and when we do oftentimes, end up voicing our opinions, it's usually qualified as being quote unquote a bitch, because women aren't supposed to be assertive. They're not supposed to be opinionated. And if they are, they're supposed to keep those opinions to themselves or say it in such a way as to not be offensive, right? And so there's this mischaracterization about women who have strong voices. How did you cope with that?
Uh, Persistence. That, as I said before, you don't male superiors, male administrators, even female administrators, or let's I say town council people that I might have been working with, they don't want to hear it. But the more you are assertive and respectful, and I'll come back to why that's important, is you start to hear from other people. Yes, I agree with you. We think we're the only one with an opinion or the only one with a question until you bring it up. And then you find out, oh, there's a lot of people that feel the same way I do. And at some point, I made a conscious decision to say, I'm going to voice these thoughts because I'm not the only one that has them.
Mm.
And then I would get support from other women around me. And you have to accept that leadership responsibility and be the voice for the people around you sometimes.
Mhm.
I use the term, sometimes you're the smartest person in the room, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way. What I mean by that is sometimes you personally understand the situation better than anybody else, better than maybe your superiors, or better than other people that are supposedly in power, but you have a unique look on the perspective. And I felt it was incumbent upon me to share that sometimes for the people around me, not just for myself.
Right. And that's often lost. I think, sometimes people don't want to be thrust with responsibility. It's like, what, I don't want to be the voice. I don't want to be the one that's calling attention to a wrong, because then that comes with responsibility that I don't want to take on. But you didn't have that issue. You were okay with that. And I think that that's great, especially being a mother of two sons, because I think, for young men to see that, I think it's really important. It changes their mindset. So even though the world may be saying that women aren't necessarily capable of making decisions, aren't good decision makers or leaders, they were watching you along the way, and they were seeing, oh, my mother, she's well known, she's well respected, she speaks up on these issues, and she's getting things done. I think that that's a great message, especially for young men.
Well, I wanted that for my sons, but I also wanted that for my students. And I'll be honest, in particular for my female students, I really felt it was important to empower them to be able to speak for themselves. I was cognizant all the time teaching of calling on the girls, getting the girls involved, because it is true. You'll get to middle school, and the younger students, you get a good mix of boy girls that want to participate in class. As they get older, there's less and less females that want to participate in classroom discussions. But if you draw them into it, then you really find that they have a wealth of knowledge, and they want to share. They just tend to get quiet. And
Mhm.
it's particularly interesting when you give them tasks and you watch how the females will approach a task, and they work really well. They tend to work well in groups. And they tend to enjoy the hands-on work, which people would say, oh, the girls will be more cerebral. They won't like the hands-on work, and that's not true at all. The
Right.
girls love the labs. They really enjoyed getting that hands-on material.
But you're right, because we go through that stage in middle school where we're very concerned with how other people view us, right? And self-esteem is really important. We want to fit in, so we don't want to necessarily call attention to ourselves. And in some cases, we don't want boys to think that we're smarter than they are. And so we quiet down.
And I don't know where that comes from,
Yeah.
but it, it's a shame.
Mhm.
Uh, I toy with the idea of what would happen if we taught, all girl and all boy classes sometimes in the high school. I offered to do that. I offered to have, split the classes up just to see, as a little social experiment, what would happen. And, that didn't go very far in public school,
Well,
but
and here's the thing, that's why we do have all women's colleges throughout the country, because it was determined that oftentimes in the areas of science and math, that girls in general, kind of clam up and shut down when they have to, in essence, compete with men in those environments because they don't want to appear too smart. And so that really was why, they've created women's colleges throughout the United States, because they figure, okay, if they don't have to compete with men, now they have no reason to be silent. And truly, in some ways, it has succeeded. But obviously, the interaction between male and female, especially during those formative years, is also essential in the development of you as a person. So something like a course in high school where that class would be divided by gender might work, because then the other courses, there is that blending. You are interacting.
right.
Mhm.
I think at that formative age in middle school, it was important to um, let girls hear their own voice and understand that they could express their knowledge. They could ask their questions. They could have a formative discussion about topics and ideas. And I didn't shy away from bringing in other topics besides science, which was always good for the
Mhm.
students.
So my last question, Mrs. Thomas, is
Mhm.
what advice would you give to a young woman in her early 20s who is, at the cusp of trying to figure out what she's going to do with the rest of her life, knowing what you know and the interactions you've had with really young girls, and the development of these young girls?
I gave that some serious thought because I have two boys in their 20s that are they're trying to go on, and I think it's more difficult um, for the women even than for men to try and figure out how they're going to go forward. And what I could say is just don't stop. Inertia is a bad thing. Keep trying. If you find, I tend to think in terms of careers. Where do women want to go with their careers? Um, Try something. Keep in mind, there's no perfect job. There's no perfect relationship. Um, you want to keep working to improve things, but experiment and try jobs, try joining organizations where you can learn things. Just because you take a job at 22 doesn't mean that's going to be your job when you retire, but
Mhm.
that will give you the opportunity to learn things and communicate with people and explore your world. It's not, I know when we graduate college, we think, oh, this is, I should have this all figured out. You do not have it all figured out.
Well, and then life takes you down some paths that you weren't expecting, right?
Right?
So you have to be able to have a plan that's malleable, that is going to be able to be shaped as you grow, mature, and change.
Right. And be prepared for that change. Don't think you're stuck in one direction. And you're capable. You're capable by yourself to be able to do things. You don't a partner's nice, but it's not necessary. If you figure out how you can make solutions, reach out to other women. Women do not reach out to one another enough. Just one of my last things I want to say is that I suffer from a generalized anxiety disorder, and people never spoke about that. And when I made that decision many years ago to admit that to people, they were like, wow, you too? You
Mm.
take a medication for your anxiety disorder? And I said, yeah, I do. And I have for a long time.
Mhm.
And that doesn't mean there's anything wrong with that. And women need to share amongst themselves those kind of ideas. Um, And so that's why I always felt comfortable sharing that with other women. But reach out, ask questions, and look at where women are going and what they can do and what you can do as a person.
Well, I'm glad that you shared that. And I agree. There's a lot of people who have anxiety for different reasons, and it is important to get help, and it is important either to seek a therapist or, if necessary, medication. You shouldn't have to suffer with that on your own, because there are strategies for coping through anxiety. And when it's not something that works, when that doesn't work, then there are medications. But you're right, oftentimes people don't want to speak about mental health. They don't want to speak about, no one wants to appear broken, in some way. But every single one of us, none of us are perfect. I mean, none of us. Each of us has something that either we don't like about ourselves, we wish we could change, whatever the thing in your head. I mean, and this is common for women in general, to often have low self-esteem, right? To often feel we're inadequate, not enough, not pretty, not this, not that, all so many things. And I think part of the reason that I wanted to do this series is to make sure that women understood, you're not alone. There
Right.
are so many women in the same situation.
Right. You
And
need to look at your peers, not look at the TV, not look at the magazines, you know, around you. You're you're enough around you, and don't compare yourself to unreal expectations. Basically, that's what I wanted to say, is that, have realistic expectations, keep, have high goals,
right.
but have realistic expectations, and keep shooting for those goals.
All right, Mrs. Thomas, thank you so much.
Thank you.